Well, hello, folks out there in YouTube land. Got a big show lined up for you. Let's get right into this one. All right, folks, the ACC, is it collapsing? Yeah, I think it is. But Commissioner Phillips of the ACC doesn't necessarily think so.
Please disperse. Nothing to see here, please.
Yeah, but I think he's living in a little bit of fantasy land on that. This is not looking good for the ACC. Not financially, not politically, not in the lawsuits that are against them. It's a big mess, and I'm going to get in the nuts and bolts of this, and it's going to get a little bit ugly. I'm going to have some real talk with you about this. If you're somebody that's super sensitive and you don't want to hear anything negative about the ACC, probably not the show for you. Humongous, tell them.
Just walk away.
Yeah, Humongous usually knows best, and like I said, I don't want anybody going in the comment section about how I upset you and all that. So this is for folks that want to hear the reality of what's happening. And oh, by the way, for the SEC and Big Ten folks watching this, you think, well, this doesn't really affect us. It directly affects you. It's going to affect the SEC and Big Ten big time because these schools, the big top dogs, are going to want to join either the Big Ten or the SEC. And some of them are worth taking. And then you've got Notre Dame sitting over there who isn't even a member of a conference, but kind of is a member of the ACC because they can't join a conference. They're too good for that.
Well, Lottie frickin' da!
But anyway, they're going to be a part of this as well on some level. Now, the fellow that's been doing a great job on this is Ross Dellinger. He's really been on top of what's happening with the ACC and what's going on with all the college settlement talk and all that kind of stuff. All of this is going to play together. If you're in the ACC or you're a fan of a team, there's some things that need to happen. Let's say you're an FSU fan, Clemson fan, something like that. You need something to give because if everything stays the same, you're going to be $30 to $40 million behind all the SEC and Big Ten schools. Plus, you're going to be another $30 million worth of expenses behind because of the settlement that the NCAA is getting ready to do with the House versus NCAA, Hubbard, Carter, all of those lawsuits that are combining into a big, huge settlement of around $2.7 billion, which is going to be about $30 million a team per year. So this is going to get very real, and there's teams, like I said, FSU, Clemson, North Carolina, that things need to happen, or you're going to be $60 to $70 million underwater. And now one of the things we're dealing with right now is North Carolina. They want out of the ACC suddenly so bad they can't stand it.
Get me out of here! Here, just eat that! Leave us alone!
Yeah, they're having financial problems there. They've called in an auditor. Their AD, Bubba Cunningham, who has been basically carrying water for the ACC and pretty much told FSU that they needed to just go ahead and pay the $500 million and then wait till 2036 to get out of their grant of rights. He didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for him. Well, now he's eating crow because the trustees over there are not happy with him. He has been called back. He's not even at that ACC conference because he's got to put out fires at North Carolina. They got a $16 to $17 million deficit as far as they're losing money. And the trustees are like, look, we're losing our butt over here. You're over here talking good about the ACC. We want out. We want out of this because we see the forest for the trees. We're going to be so far behind, we're not going to be able to compete on any level. And we're going to be losing our butts, and we're going to have to pull money from everywhere else just to keep the sports going, which that does not sit well with the powers that be at a big university like North Carolina. All of a sudden, you can't build a new architecture building because you got to keep the sports going. You can't give the big raises to the professors who are already making huge money. They want more money. And if they can't get it because of the sports, you're going to have a lot of this. So let's get into what Ross was talking about here. And there's a bunch of important information. And they're talking about one administrator said the Big Ten and the SEC have cut us open and they're just watching us bleed out. And there's some truth to that. And here he says the North Carolina trustee said, I'm advocating for leaving the ACC. He said that's what we need to do. We need to do everything we can to get there. Or the alternative is the ACC is going to have to reconstruct itself. I think all options are on the table. And we know Florida State and Clemson are already in a huge lawsuit against the ACC. And Commissioner Phillips said that is very difficult, disruptive, and harmful as far as lawsuits. He said, but that's the world we live in. We'll let the legal folks handle it. It hasn't changed one iota how we've interacted with them, etc. Philip said he's looking for a really good ending. Really? You think there's going to be a really good ending? Right. Here the writer says the chances of such a move feel fleeting. The hope is dwindling. Every new change within college athletics exasperates the revenue gap between the SEC and the Big Ten. And I'm just going to show you the revenue gap rather than explaining it. It's just better to put it on a big old chart, and I've got that here. And if you've watched this show, you've seen this before. This is what the Big Ten and the SEC get from their television contracts. And as you can see, the ACC is anywhere from $20 to $25 million behind as far as every year. But there's additional problems. And that's this chart right here. This is the college football playoff money distribution. And the SEC and Big Ten strong-armed everybody. And they pretty much told them, said, look, we're the one that's always in the playoff because we're the best. And we need more money, and we're going to get more money. Otherwise, we're going to go off on our own and just leave you stranded. And so the ACC and Big 12 had to agree. And here's the breakdown. So there's another $10 million that the ACC and Big 12 will be down. So now you're looking at $30 to $40 million a year combined that they're behind the SEC and Big 10. And here it talks about the ACC school that one of them is budgeting for an additional $30 million annually in the combination of revenue sharing with current athletes, back damages to former athletes, and expansion of scholarships. And folks, that's a whole different kettle of fish that we were talking about earlier with the possible settlement over all these lawsuits, the back pay that a lot of athletes feel like, or back damages, they feel like they're owed because they weren't allowed to make any money through NIL. So they sued the NCAA. That's the House versus NCAA and the Hubbard and Carter. There's also one called Fontenot. So they're trying to combine them all, try to settle for 2.7 and change, 2.7 billion, by the way. And the way that would work, each team would have to come up with $300 million each over the next 10 years, which would be $30 million a year. And that's what the ACC team was talking about there in that little sentence, that they know $30 million a year is what it's going to take. $20 million of which would be shared with the athletes up to 20. And not all the schools have to opt in. But if you don't, you're way behind everybody else. So there's 20. Then they're also going to have to offer more scholarships, which is another $10 million, and $2 million per year in back damages. It's close to around $30 million a year is what the total price tag is going to be. And like I say, ACC's 30 to 40 million behind the SEC and the Big Ten. So it's a monster problem. And you can see why FSU and Clemson, North Carolina, they see the handwritings on the wall. This is a mess. And Phillips can sit here and talk about how everything's Shangri-La and it's all wonderful. And that's easy to do when you're getting a big paycheck and you just want to keep everything going the same way. He's not going to have to come up with that extra money. Well, these schools are going to have to. And they see this. And it's got them worried. Now let's talk about ESPN. Remember, ESPN has the grant of rights for the SEC and for the ACC. And you can kind of guess who they favor, especially when it comes to TV and all that kind of stuff and how much they pay out. Obviously, it's the SEC.
But of course.
So there's a lot of bad blood between FSU and ESPN over not getting in the college football playoff last year. And Florida State, they're kind of mad at the world right now. They did get they were 13-0. And I know what you Georgia fans are going to say, oh, we beat them 63-3 or whatever. I understand that. But they had 10 NFL drafted players that opted out of that game. 10. Think about that. That's half the squad that starts that didn't play that would have played. And Georgia, I know what you're going to say. Well, Georgia had opt-outs too. They had 2. Georgia had 2 players opt out that got drafted, and Florida State had 10. It was not a fair ball game, and it would have been a much fairer game. I'm not saying FSU would have beat Georgia. I thought Georgia was probably the best team in the country last year, but it wouldn't have been 63-3. It would have been like 40-30 or something like that, and it would not have been impossible for FSU to win that game. Of course, they would have needed their quarterback, but anyway, FSU feels very cheated over that, and that's one of the things that sort of upended this and got this ball rolling. They were like, first of all, we're going to be $30 million behind every year. We see it coming. We know the ACC didn't fight for us. ESPN, they feel like they kind of got creaked out of the playoff, and ESPN played a role in that because Alabama got in and Texas got in, both with 1 loss, but Florida State didn't, and they were undefeated.
That's not fair.
Don't raise your voice to me.
So there's a lot of animosity there. Phillips described the impending settlement as a seismic shift as far as the settlement with the NCAA. And the ACC is trying to make some of the teams happy by changing some of the college football playoff monies. Basically, if you perform better in the college football playoff, you can make more money. So a Florida State or a Clemson or whoever does well in the playoff can get extra monies. It's not going to come close to making up the difference, though. It's just not. Even if Florida State won the national title, they still would be behind financially the Vanderbilt, for example. They can't make up the difference just from the college football playoff. It's not enough. It wouldn't even come close. Phillips said, we're not standing still. We're trying to address that gap. It's not going to do it. The initiative said will help mitigate the gap, said Miami Athletic Director Dan Radakovich. While more money doesn't always lead to more success, there is a correlation. He's right about that, but it's not enough. Now let's talk about what's happening with the ACC in the lawsuit with FSU, Clemson, and how they have to keep a certain number of teams. Otherwise, ESPN, which has a look-in provision that we didn't know about until recently, they can undo the grant of rights and renegotiate it with the ACC. And why that matters, we're getting ready to get into. It talks about their grant of rights contract that runs through 2036.
Are you sure?
And why it says maybe, said there are largely two ways that ESPN itself could set fire to the contract. If the ACC drops below the requisite 15-member threshold, or if SEC elects next February to decline to opt into the final 9 years of the deal. That's two ways ESPN can say this contract's over if we want it to be over.
It's over. Nothing is over. Nothing. You just don't turn it off.
ACC doesn't have that option. And if FSU, Clemson, North Carolina, whoever drops out of the ACC, they drop below 15, that triggers it right there. And the ESPN can say, well, hey, FSU's out, Clemson's out. That's a big part of the value of ACC. I mean, let's just get frank about it. Who would you care about? If FSU drops out, Clemson drops out, or if, Boston College or Wake Forest drops out? You know, ESPN knows where the value is. It's in the top. It's always in the top teams. And who's suing? The top teams. And who's threatening to drop out? Top teams. Says the league and its TV partner in active negotiations over what Phillips did confirm is a look-in provision. He said, we are working internally with them on a piece of the contract. The partnership is not going away or being affected in a negative light. What? They can opt out, dude. What do you mean it's not being affected? If they tear up that contract and say we're ready to renegotiate, it's a major problem. You might lose another $10 or $20 million a year. Because I promise you, if FSU, Clemson, North Carolina, teams like that drop out of the conference, what do you think ESPN's going to pay you?
Check, please.
Now, here's one of the big issues. In order for the Big Ten SEC to expand, let's say they take in some of those teams, they're going to have to get more money from ESPN. Now, why that matters is, where's ESPN going to get that money? Look, they're not exactly floating in dollar bills over there. They're struggling at ESPN. They're not going to just say, oh, well, you've added Florida State, you've added Clemson. Yeah, that adds value to the SEC. Here's more money. No, what they're going to have to do is cut their expenses with the ACC. So they're going to have to give that to the SEC. They're going to have to drop those expenses by saying, okay, Clemson, Florida State, they opted out. We're not going to pay you as much on that contract. We're renegotiating it. Then they can come back and they can pay the SEC more if they take those teams on. Because obviously the SEC with Florida State, Clemson, or whoever, North Carolina, et cetera, is going to be a more valuable conference with those big dogs suddenly in the SEC. And a conference official said there isn't as much money in the market as there once was, what I was just talking about. There's not. I'm telling you, people are struggling, and ESPN is no different. They've had a lot of cord cutting, and ESPN's had to let a lot of people go. A lot of big-time personalities at ESPN got let go to save money, and they're not done with that. So the only way they could find more money is if they save money on the ESPN contract, and they have the ability to do it two separate ways. Now, it talks about the Big 12. They might be willing to take in some of those teams, and that's certainly possible. But the Big 12, it's not as lucrative, so it'd be a little bit tricky. But that would be a landing spot if they couldn't get in one of the Big Two. And before you say the ACC is not going to collapse, it would never collapse. That's what the Pac-12 thought. What happened there?
You cursed brat! Look what you've done! I'm melting! Melting! Oh, what a world! What a world!
That's right. It melted like that overnight. It was like it was overnight, honestly. And that's probably how the ACC could go if they're not careful. I think that's why they brought in Stanford and SMU and California, which again, those aren't big dogs football powerhouses. They're just not. All they did was add numbers. They didn't add clout, and they didn't add value. And I'm sorry to Stanford and SMU and California, but I mean, that's just, I told you I'm going to be blunt in this video, and they're just not, all they are is a number. All they really are is just keeping them at 15, but they don't join until July. So if this happens over the next month or two, ESPN can automatically get out of that contract and change the grant of rights. And they can do it anytime they want up through February of next year, which I think they would do if all of a sudden the conference was missing two of their biggest hitters. So look for a lot of movement over the next several weeks, and also realize that when this settlement happens, that may be an instigator that FSU, Clemson, and other teams like North Carolina just say, okay, it's too much. We've got this settlement. We got to come up with $30 million for that. We're $30 million behind, $40 million behind on this grant of rights every year. We have to do something. We have no choice. And then they strike. And they go ahead and drop out of the ACC, which triggers ESPN to renegotiate the grant of rights. And then all of a sudden the SEC's over here, Big Ten's over here, and trying to figure out who's going to take who. And there'll probably be a competition. Notre Dame's going to be the most interesting one because they're probably a better fit than Big Ten, but any conference would take Notre Dame. I can go ahead and tell you the SEC would take them, Big Ten would take them, like that. So expect a ton of movement. Or, crap, Notre Dame will probably just stay over there in the independent because, look, that's just who they are.
Ew, get off of me. Ugh, as if.
But anyway, just look for a lot to happen the next 30 days. More is going to happen in the next month or two than we've seen in the last 30 years in football. I mean, it's just a fact. This is insane, the times we're living in right now. And the amount of movement, change, in that article, they called it seismic. That's exactly what it's going to be. So if you want to keep up with that type of stuff, hit this little button right here. This is the subscribe button. Doesn't cost you a dime, and I try to cover all this big stuff. And right over here is the most recent video YouTube thinks you'll enjoy based on your viewing history. And we'll see you next time on Sports Talk Jay.